Tonight we're in for something very, very special. As I told you last night, one of our agendas in the evening programs is to expose you to various individuals, various ideas, various movements which are critical for understanding where Israel is, and some evenings are about critical to understand what our hopes are for where Israel is going to go. While this institute doesn't have any position as an institute on the political left and right-wing divides vis-a-vis issues of security and West Bank, etc., and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have very, very definite positions about the issue of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And at the core of this institute's being is an understanding that the category of a homeland for the Jewish people is not some amorphic, nice-feeling statement that, look, everybody could be here, or some political statement that we want Abu Mazen to sign off on, even though we don't have a clue what it means. It is something that obligates us. If this is the homeland of the Jewish people, that means every Jew anywhere in the world has to feel that this place is their home. Religious pluralism is not an ideology. It has to be a public political policy. And that means whether you are Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, renewal, post-denominational, secular, affiliated, non-affiliated, if this is your home, this is not just a place that you get to fight for and die in. This is a place where you get to bring into the public sphere with full dignity and respect the totality of your religious beliefs, and that you get to express them in that public space. And until Israel doesn't do that, this is not the homeland of the Jewish people. It's words. And we as an institution are we are politically involved. Our teachers are involved. And it is an essential feature of this space. And tonight, you're going to have the privilege of being introduced to one of the most cutting edge, and I would say one of the most hopeful new initiatives to try to create the Israel that you could feel a part of. Not an Israel that you have to join or support because it's dying or it's in danger, but an Israel that you could feel, yes, it hears me. I could be a part of this place. And it reflects the most noble of our liberal Jewish values. And that initiative is called Chai, which for tonight does not mean 18. It means Chatuna Yisraelit. It means an Israeli marriage. It's an initiative which believes that we could possibly create a tipping point in Israeli society by looking at a transformation in the laws of marriage in this country and create here the option of a civil marriage. It's a coalition made up of Orthodox, conservative, Reform, secular institutions, including this one. Recently I had this institute join that coalition. And tonight you're going to get a chance to hear about it. It's about the best of what Israel can become, and it's about what Israel, if it's going to fulfill its deepest Zionist mission, not to be a denominational shul, but to be a country for all Jews. This is the direction I believe that this country has to go. And you're going to hear from two very special people tonight. Very, very special people. The first is someone who, if you're an Israeli, this is the only person you would not have to introduce at all. And that is Dr. Minna Tzemach. The reason why is because, I don't know, since I could remember, whenever you want to know something, whether it's the most accurate reports on electoral results, or when you want to hear something about trends in Israeli society, this is the high priest. You're meeting tonight the high priest of Israeli statistics. I could talk about her BA in sociology from Hebrew University. She has a BA in psychology from Hebrew University. She has an MSc in psychology from Yale. She has a PhD in social psychology. She's done what she needs to do. But she's the person that Israelis trust. When she says, we listen. She's accurate. She's not politically inclined. She has a mission for Israelis to understand who they are, what's happening, and to have it straight. And when we used to have one channel, life was easy, but now the choice of which channel you watch for the election results is quite simple. It's the one that Minna Tzemach is on. You don't care the other guy, like the nice face, who looks sweet, that's not, like that. It's where she is where you want to go. And she's going to be speaking, and she's going to be giving to tonight's presentation some of its sociological data, which would be important to understand where Israel's society is. She will be our second speaker. Our first speaker is somebody who you don't need to be introduced to, because anybody who has any concerns or any thoughts about how Israel will be a Jewish and democratic state knows that the one who's been carrying this for decades is our guest tonight, Rabbi Uri Regev. There's lots of things in his bio. He serves as the president and CEO of the Educational Advisory Israeli Diaspora Partnership Chidush, Freedom of Religion for Israel. And also its Israeli branch, Chidush for Freedom of Religion and Equality, founded in 2009. And his bio is filled with numerous significant leadership positions on every level, both within his movement, the Reform movement, and within Jewish communal life here in Israel. An important part of his bio are his two children. I love this. I think they give expression to your two loves, if I'm going to say that. One, he has a daughter, Liron, who graduated from the Culinary Institute of America and is working as the pastry chef at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem. That's, But one of the most beautiful things also is that his son, Yonatan, was ordained as a rabbi of HUC and currently serves in Temple Sinai Temple in Oakland, California. But more than all the details, there are people who I feel, as an Israeli, that I owe them. I feel indebted to them. Because I could do certain things, and then I go home at night and watch television. And I do some stuff, and I do maybe a little more, a little less. And there's people who are in the trenches and who are fighting a fight day in and day out for years, before anybody else did, and longer than anybody else did, and still to this day. He was one of the first voices who said, Israeli society can't just talk about Aliyah, can't just talk about the fact that we're going to read our Declaration of Independence and speak about democracy. Israeli society has to change its legal codes, its legal traditions, its legal history. It has to change what it does, and it has to create a truly democratic society where freedom of religion and religious expression is self-evident for every Israeli. But the reason why we owe him is that not only has he carried what every one of us believes and yearns for, and carried it very often alone, but he did it in the midst of an environment which very often was very hostile. This was not a supporting environment. He was alone. And he didn't stop. And I could tell you now, in 2014, we are closer to having the Israel that we want than we were 10 years ago and 20 years ago. And there is no doubt that one of the reasons why we are closer is because of this man sitting right next to me. He's a beautiful soul and a courageous man. And he fights. He fights very simply for religious freedom. And there's nothing more noble than that. It is truly my honor and my privilege for you to hear a very, very important story. And most significantly, for you both to hear from and to start the evening by giving a significant and profound thanks to Rabbi Uri Regev. Please.
Thank you, Donniel. This group is constantly growing. And it's growing because those who came before keep coming and tell their friends that they ought to be here as well. And in part, and I would say probably the main part, it's because of the wonderful people that this institute brings together. And it's a challenge because basically, we could close the evening now after Donniel has spoken, and there is very little to add. But I hope that we'll be able to add some additional layers of understanding to the challenge at hand that Donniel alluded to. And then, just as important for us, for Minna and me, and for our initiative, Chai Chatuna Israelit, it is for us to hear you and engage in conversation, because we firmly believe that together, Israelis and partners committed to the cause of strengthening both Israel and the Jewish people throughout the Jewish world, we can make a difference. So it's important for us to hear you just as much as it is for us to share the story with you. So let me start by mentioning three people that I have met. One of them is particularly close to me, whose stories, I think, will give you a sense of the challenge of freedom of marriage is not just a theory. It's about people who may be your children or grandchildren, may have been yourself, people that you have struggled for in your different capacities as active members of the Jewish community. So let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah lives in Israel now. She was born and adopted at the age of 1 by a family in Ventura, California. Her father was the mayor of Ventura. The family was active in the Reform congregation there. And having adopted a non-Jewish baby, they wanted to make sure that she's part of the Jewish people. And they realized that there is a who is a Jew issue, and therefore wanted to make sure that her conversion includes the element of tvilah, of ritual ablution in a mikveh, and therefore they arranged with the University of Judaism to have the UJ Beth Din convert this 1-year-old baby, who grew up to be a beautiful, active, Jewishly committed, to the point that she made Aliyah. And she wanted to get married after having fallen in love with Tzachi, who was a commander in the army of a missile boat and is working in a security position to this day. And then they realized that, lo and behold, she was Jewish enough to make Aliyah on the basis of her adoption into a Jewish family, on the basis of her conversion at the University of Judaism. But she's not Jewish enough to get married in Israel. And what she had to endure was having a very meaningful liberal marriage ceremony with many friends and guests and family, with a Reform rabbi that had no legal validity whatsoever, and then travel to Cyprus and get married there, and then travel to Ventura and do a third ceremony, and go back to Israel and register that Cyprus marriage to be recognized as a married couple in Israel. Second is Tanya Margulis. Tanya came to Israel at the age of 4 from the Ukraine with her family. Now you can't get much more Jewish than Margulis, but of course Margulis is her father's name. But her mother is one of the very, very many Russian olim who is not halachically Jewish. As a matter of fact, anyone who knows anything about the Russian Jewish community knows that assimilation and intermarriage was prevalent there, even more than it is in the States, and it's pretty prevalent in the States. So here they come as a family. She's 4 years old, grows in Israel, studies at the university, serves in a combat unit in the army, and falls in love and wants to marry a career officer in this combat unit, and lo and behold realizes, yes, she's an Israeli citizen, yes, she has been here since the age of 4, and no, she can't get married. Because her being an Israeli citizen just isn't enough for her to be able to legally marry in Israel, because her mother is not Jewish. In a minute, I'll explain the context. And the third, as I said, is very close to me. Actually, it's my daughter. So our daughter married a few months ago in August. Now, there is no question of the Jewish status. There is no question of the Jewish status of her husband, who is also Israeli-born, Israeli Jew, except they want a marriage which is befitting their beliefs and lifestyle. They wanted to be married in an egalitarian, progressive ceremony, a progressive egalitarian ketubah, and that's not legally possible in Israel. So what we did is, again, one of our family friends who is a rabbi married the couple. Hundreds of, I don't know if you have been to Israeli wedding, it's quite different, you have. Quite different than the American custom, you know. In Israel you invite everybody that works with you and everybody who's, living in the building next to you, and their children and their, the makoletnik, the grocery store, etc. It's a mob scene. So yes, we had 400 or 500 people of our closest friends and family, and it was fantastic, except it had no legal validity whatsoever. 2 days later, we all packed up our suitcases, the groom's family, our family, and traveled to New York. And in New York, being an Israeli citizen and a resident of Jerusalem, I have a license to officiate at weddings under the laws of the state of New York. So my daughter and son-in-law went to the city hall, registered. I signed the marriage certificate with our good friend Jackie Allenson, Rabbi Jackie Allenson being the second, the witness. And on the basis of that document, signed by me in New York, the couple went back to Israel a week later and were able to register themselves as a married couple. Because my signature in New York carries the weight and validity of the laws of the state of New York, which allow basically freedom of choice in marriage. And my signature on a ketubah in Israel does not mean anything. Now, let me put it in context for just a couple of minutes. One thing that is extremely important is what you will be hearing from Dr. Minna Tzemach, namely, let's not confuse the issues. This is not that the people of Israel want my daughter not to be able to marry according to her wishes in an egalitarian ceremony, Tanya Margulis, who has lived most of her life in Israel and is an Israeli citizen, or Sarah, who made Aliyah from Ventura to be able to marry in Israel. On the contrary. So you will be hearing what Israelis would like Israel to be, and you will be amazed, or some of you probably know it, you'll be happy to know that that vision, that overriding vision of what Israel is about, and what Israel is about in terms of its relationship with the Jewish people, is shared very much along the same lines that you conform to, that you subscribe to, by the overwhelming majority of Israelis. But you'll be hearing more about that there. Let me put it in the context of Israel's law and Israel's unholy alliance of religion and state as it is. The law provides for only religious marriages to be recognized when performed in Israel. for Jews and non-Jews alike. There is no civil marriage, and ironically, when it comes to non-Jews, pluralism actually is the flavor of the year, of the decade, because all Christian denominations, for instance, are recognized on equal footing. When it comes to Judaism, the only authority to officiate in legal weddings is in the hands of the Orthodox rabbinate. Which means Tanya Margulis couldn't marry in Israel because, yes, she's an Israeli citizen, but there is no forum for her to marry in because the Orthodox rabbinate doesn't recognize her as Jewish, and there is no civil marriage. Sarah couldn't marry in Israel, even though she's registered as a Jew in the population registry because she converted at the age of 1, because the civil registry of who is a Jew is different than the religious registry, which is controlled and limited to those that the Orthodox established rabbinate recognizes as Jews. And my daughter couldn't marry because the Orthodox official rabbinate would not offer her the ability of having an egalitarian marriage ceremony. Interestingly, this is now a phenomenon that, as Donniel will be able to tell you, as many in the Hartman Institute will be able to tell you, it's a phenomenon that more and more Orthodox couples subscribe to, and most recently, I don't think he's part of the faculty at Hartman yet, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, Professor Samuel Hellman, one of the leading experts on Jewish history, on the Orthodox, on Orthodoxy in modern. His son made Aliyah, married a few months ago to another modern Orthodox psychologist with very strong opinions about her role in Jewish life. And they didn't feel that they could marry in a way that was befitting their beliefs, and therefore here is an Orthodox couple, which is just one of many and a growing number of Orthodox couples that say, we believe in tradition, but we don't believe in the rabbinate. And we want a traditional marriage ceremony, which the rabbinate is not able to provide us, and therefore you have a growing number of Orthodox couples who do private weddings. They don't want to set foot in the chief rabbinate's offices. So what is the context? The context is that currently in Israel, as you will be hearing, with the foundation that Rabbi Hartman mentioned, the foundation that we find in Israel's Declaration of Independence that assures us that the state, the Jewish state to be, is going to be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets, will uphold full social and political equality to all regardless of religion, and will ensure freedom of religion and conscience, is, as you'll be able to see here, and research that we have done in the research that we have done as to the status of freedom of marriage in all the world. We checked the status of freedom of marriage in 194 countries of the world and found that, and we coded it in 3 colors, black, gray, and white. Black are the countries that impose severe restrictions on the right of their citizens to marry. Gray are the countries with some restrictions, and white are the countries that practice freedom of marriage. Now, don't ask me, I'll tell you ahead of you asking me, because I'm being asked that again and again when I present the map. Freedom, as we have explained, is not based on the question of same-sex marriage. Because what we realized is that there are too few countries that recognize same-sex marriage or civil unions, and we list them and we note them, but we explain that when there are more countries, we will revisit the coding. But there are 45 countries in the world in the category of those that impose severe restrictions on the right of their citizens to marry. And you take one look at the map and you get the idea. It's not a pretty neighborhood. 67% of the countries, of these 45 countries, are countries that impose Sharia law. Israel is the only Western democracy in that category. One and only Western democracy in that category. Now that isn't just because of the theory. That is because currently in Israel, hundreds of thousands of citizens cannot marry, period. Cannot marry. Now, it isn't just Tanya and Sarah. They represent approximately 500,000 who cannot marry. There are millions more who cannot marry in a way that is befitting their life choices and beliefs. You'll hear the statistics from Dr. Minna Tzemach, but I can tell you, when you calculate the percentage and the number of Jews in Israel, you realize it's millions who would like to be married differently than what is currently offered as the only option for Jews to marry. Now you'll ask me, so what is it for us? Why should that concern us? It should concern you because Sarah is just one example, and I could talk about Jessica, and I could talk about Ariel, and I could talk about Aaron, and I could talk about many others. I remember a group of Knesset members meeting with the late Frank Lautenberg in one of the Who is a Jew debates, and him telling them, and this was the point when it really, as we say, Simon Nafal, the coin, well, whatever is the parallel, namely it hit them. That was the moment it hit them and they understood what is at stake. He said, you don't understand. For you, this is a political issue, but it's my grandchildren that you're talking about. And they got it. So please understand and think about the nature of the American Jewish community. And for that matter, I don't know the statistics in Dutch. I apologize, and I don't know how many other countries are represented here. But please realize this is a question that will be facing and is facing the Sarahs of the Jewish community, who are the majority of the children growing up in the American Jewish community today. And therefore, what's so important about what Rabbi Hartman chose to introduce the theme of the discussion tonight by is, this is an issue, a concern, but it shouldn't be seen as a standalone. It should be seen in the context of that which is so critical and central to the way that the Hartman Institute deals with Israel diaspora engagement, but is not sufficiently discussed elsewhere, at least not until now. And that is, our engagement with Israel is not just because of a sentimental connection, not just because we think that, Israel is an important thing, just as we have insurance policies or covering us, on a variety of other concerns and eventualities. Israel is one of them, because who knows? Israel, I believe, for most of you, if not all of you, is something that we feel is central to our identity as Jews, to our membership in the Jewish people. One cannot seriously think about the future of the Jewish people today without thinking of the role that Israel plays in that peoplehood concept. And to the extent that Israel is going to live up to that which most Israelis desire, and that which is the inspirational vision of the Declaration of Independence, imagine, rooted in the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets, exercises, practices, full political and social equality to all, regardless of religion, gender, or race, and promises to uphold freedom of religion and conscience. What a fantastic partnership. What a fantastic light unto the Jewish people and unto the nations we will have. We will have. But there's work to be done. Because at this point, Israel is the one and only Western democracy which denies its citizens the right to marry, which would deny today, if we are not going to be able to work together to bring about change together, not just we sitting at this table and you, but together we, the majority of Israelis, this silent majority that needs help to be mobilized, but is clearly desiring a Israel which is open and pluralistic and embracing and inclusive. We have work to do to make that become a reality. I'll finish with good news, because Rabbi Hartman said, I've been alone for many years, not quite alone, but yes, it was not the most popular cause, and yes, my late mother thought that I would do better settling in a comfortable law practice, because I also wear a legal hat. And And I felt differently. I felt that my life will mean more to me if it's dedicated to realizing that vision of Israel which is true to the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace as taught by the Hebrew prophets. But things are changing these very days, these very weeks. And with that I want to finish. June 9th, the Jewish Federations of North America approved in a dramatic, I believe, a dramatic initiative, approved what they call, I think the copywriting could be better, it's called IREP, the Israel Religious Expression Platform. But what's behind it is a commitment to embrace a project which is aimed at harnessing the Jewish federations in North America to advance religious diversity in Israel, with freedom of marriage being its initial primary focus. And two, on May 23rd, the Jewish People Policy Institute, co-chaired by Stuart Eisenstadt and Dennis Ross, submitted to the government of Israel a report on 40 discussion groups, seminars that were held all over the world over the course of the last 6 months, looking into what diaspora Jewry thinks of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. In this 100-page report, what is the common theme is how concerned people all over the world were over the issue of religion and state, and how distressing and hurtful it is, not only in their view regarding Israel's internal, domestic, Jewish and democratic character, but how hurtful it is to the cohesiveness of the Jewish people and its future solidarity with the State of Israel. Similarly, some other major Jewish organizations have recently, in the last few months, taken on this cause. And with that, I want to end. We have a tremendous, inspiring, and promising vision of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. One that we could all celebrate, that we could all be proud of. One that still needs to have further reality breathed into. We believe that this symbolizes that challenge, because it touches the dignity and the rights and the lives and the Jewish ability to express themselves Jewishly of hundreds of thousands, of millions, and many more around the world. We believe that that is a cause whose time has come for anyone who cares about the future of the State of Israel and the Jewish people. So with that, as an introduction, I will pause, and you'll hear what Israelis think about the prospect of freedom of marriage.
Okay, the findings that I'll present are based on a survey of 1,000 Israeli Jewish adult, a representative sample of the Israeli Jewish adult population. Before proceeding to present the data, the findings, I would like to say a few words about the role of public opinion in promoting policy in Israel. Examining or going back to two extremely important issues in the life of Israel, the Oslo Accord and the disengagement from Gaza, we found that public opinion preceded the leaders, preceded the attitudes of the leaders and the policy. In the Oslo, before the Oslo, even few years before the Oslo, before Rabin signed the Oslo Accord, majority of the public supported painful concessions for peace. They supported the establishment of a Palestinian state, when Rabin even did not think of it. Let me tell you that many years ago, I published a poll that I remember the number, that this was about 20 years ago, or maybe more. I published a poll that 56% are ready to support negotiations with the PLO that time, pending that the PLO will recognize the state of Israel and denounce terrorism. And someone burned my door, my apartment door, because I published this poll. At that time, some of the leaders, I won't mention the name, but some of the leaders of the peace movement called me and tell me, please don't include me in this 56%. And then, after, and going back also to the disengagement from Gaza, again, before Sharon announced his plan for the disengagement, majority of the Israeli public supported the evacuation of solitary settlements. I'll be careful enough, and I will not say that the leaders follow the public, but I can say that the public give a push to the policies, and I can definitely say that public opinion legitimize policies, especially painful policies. So now let's move to public opinion, and I want to start with some preliminary data, what I cite as background data. The profile of the Israeli Jewish population by religiosity is that we have 44% that identify themselves as secular, 22% that identify themselves as Masorti, conservative, traditional.
The conservative movement would have liked to.
Yeah. As traditional, 10 to secular, and another 10% are ultra-Orthodox, 10% are religious, what we call national religious, and 14% are traditional, 10 to religious. Demographics in Israel works in favor of the religious sector. It is reflected also in the Knesset, the number of religious Knesset members of religious party in this Knesset is higher than was in the previous Knesset. So Uri, if you want to implement changes, you have to hurry.
More children.
Now, another background data that I want to bring is that quite significant percent of the Israelis experience either themselves or via person close to them, they experience difficulties in either getting married or getting divorced. You see it 6% experience themselves and 23 additional via their close family member or friend. We had a similar question, which I will not present. We had this similar question about broadcasting, forecast, what will be the future, personal future, and altogether, past and future, about 40% either experience or expect to experience difficulties for themselves or for others close to them due to the Orthodox rabbinical monopoly on wedding. I'll skip this because we already talked about it. Now, attitudes toward instituting civil marriage. First of all, we measured the general attitude. General attitude, most Israeli, 76% of the Israeli expressed very liberal attitude, saying that everyone has the right to, I need my glasses. You see it here. Every Israeli has a right to family in Israel with whoever he chooses and whatever the way he chooses. 76% agree with this sentence. When we ask about specific about, when we ask about civil marriage, implementing in Israel civil marriage, the majority of those who has this liberal attitude, majority of them translated it into support of introducing civil marriage in Israel. Altogether, 2/3 of the Israelis, 66%, support introducing civil marriage in Israel. Let me tell you that we find this finding a long time. I think I started examining this issue, following this issue 20 or even more long, about 30 years ago, and we get always almost the same percentage that support introducing civil marriage in Israel, but as we'll see later, the political system don't support it. Now, something that if the rabbinical, the Orthodox rabbinical institutes would improve their attitudes and their service, maybe we won't need it. No, but most of the public say even if the rabbinical system improve their service and improve their attitudes, no, we still need, 66% say that we still need to implement the civil marriage. Civil marriage will solve the problem of partners of the same sex. 59%, this is due to the partners of the same sex, but 59% still support a civil marriage that will also solve the problem of partners of same sex. Now, Israelis want to solve the problem within the borders of Israel, because couple have a chance, like your daughter, they can go abroad and get married in civil wedding abroad, but no, Israelis want, 69 of the Israelis say that though we have the option to go abroad and get married and can go to Cyprus and get married very, very close, no, we want civil marriage in Israel. Now we ask them about personal preferences. We see that when we are examining the whole sample, 60% think that if we had the option for civil wedding, we still would prefer the Orthodox rabbinical wedding. Most of them are religious, but not only religious, also secular. There are secular people, persons in Israel that would have preferred the rabbinical wedding. Only if we examine the whole sample, only 36 would, I say only 36, but 36 is a very high percentage of the Israelis that would prefer a civil wedding. However, if we examine those who identify themselves as secular, we get an inverse trend. 64% would prefer, 64% of those who identified as secular said that had they the chance or the option to get married by civil marriage, they would have preferred the civil marriage. This is a huge percent of the Israeli, which means this finding, we did not find it in previous years. In previous years, though the majority, in previous years, the same 66% or 2/3 of the public supported implementing civil wedding in Israel. However, the personal preferences were different. Most of those who identify themselves secular we say they would have preferred a rabbinical wedding. This has changed during the last year. Maybe witnessing the troubles that the rabbinical, and we see it later, the troubles that the rabbinical system present before those who come to marry, and even worse, those who want to divorce. Israelis change their personal preferences. Now, what is the implication, the perceived implication of instituting civil marriage in Israel? The data, as we'll show later, I'll show you later, there is a sharp split between those who identify themselves as religious or tend to religious, and those who identify themselves as secular. You can see, if we ask them if instituting civil marriage in Israel will damage or hurt the Jewish character of Israel, 1/3, 36%, say it will damage. All of them are those who identify themselves as religious or tend to be religious, versus 62% who say it won't damage. When we ask them if they agree with the claim that if Israel would allow choosing between Orthodox and civil marriage, the Jewish people will be split into two separate groups. Again, 40%, all of them are religious, or almost all of them are religious, think that the Jewish people will be split into two groups. 55 say they won't. Now, when you ask them, we see that some of the Israelis are aware of the implications of instituting civil marriage in Israel. However, if we ask them, what do you think of the present situation? Is the present situation pushes Jews toward Judaism or away from Judaism? We see that 65% think that the present situation pushes the Israeli away from Judaism. Some of them are going abroad to get married. Even those who can get married in Israel, like your daughter, they are looking for other ways of getting married. Now, should we like a struggle for promoting civil marriage in Israel? 65% think, again, those who identify themselves as secular or traditional tend to secular. 65% think it is important to lead a struggle for a freedom of marriage in Israel, versus 1/3 who think it's not important. However, most of the public think that the chances that the political system will pass a bill of civil marriage is low. 37 think it's very low, 17 low, and additional 16 somewhat low. So right now, Israeli don't think that we can trust the political system that something will move, that it will move, and probably you know why. The coalition, first time that we don't have the ultra-religious or the ultra-Orthodox in the coalition, but we have the Orthodox party in the coalition, and every party who is forming the government think that maybe not today, but tomorrow they'll need the ultra-Orthodox for the coalition. So what this would lead us, where this would lead us, the combination or the interaction of the attitudes supporting institution of civil marriage with the disbelief in the political system, this can lead us either that the attitudes remain as an attitude, as in many, many cases, or that the public will protest and that the public will do something, as they did 2 years ago on social economic issues, which moved a lot. At the beginning of my talk, I said that that Israeli public opinion preceded the policy of the leaders. You should take these findings and proceed and mobilize and translate this public opinion into actions. Thank you.
Please, we're going to institute, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. We're going to institute a policy which will be very, very helpful. There's about 150 people. We have about 10 larger lecture sessions. That means if you raise your hand more than twice, you probably shouldn't. And we want to avoid the problem of the quick draw questions, because some people have them right away, sometimes it takes you. We want to make sure that all of you have a chance to talk, have a chance to participate in the conversation. So I'm going to ask of you to, if you've already asked 2 or 3 questions, wait a little while for some other people to think for a moment and be able to join. If there's quiet, those of you who have more questions, feel free to join in. So of those who haven't asked a lot yet, yes, sir, in the back, could I just see a show of hands for where we're going to go? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those will be our first 5, and then we'll go to the next 5, okay? Good.
I have 2 what I hope are brief questions.
Could you stand?
Sure. I have 2 what I hope are brief questions. I looked at the statistics and questions you ask. I don't know whether there were other questions that you asked, but very often if you ask whether something is important, not in comparison to other issues, many things become important in a statistical analysis. Are there any questions that you ask that compare this issue to security issues, or this issue to economic issues, so that when you see it in the broader, because you say that there's support, but it's a question of support in comparison to competing issues. And the second issue is directed, and I'm bad at names, Uri, is when you talk about this, you're talking about it as a civil secular, or are you talking at the issue as if it's a religious pluralistic issue? Because in the United States, just to bring sort of the gay marriage, since it was mentioned, right, there was a strong view that civil partnerships was not the right kind of dignity in comparison to civil marriage. So I wanted to ask sort of these of the two.
It's a very good question, but in Israel, you can't compare anything to the security issues, because the security swallows everything. And you cannot compare to economic issues, because again, the economic also, the most 2 important question is economic and security. When we compare it to other questions, like special education, not so important questions, it is in the middle. When you have a list of 10 problems, we did not have it in this poll, but we had it in another poll. When you have a list of other issues, not that important as security in economic, it's in the middle of the scale.
I'll refer to the first question, even though it was addressed to Dr. Tzemach, because one of the things that I've been doing in the organization that I'm heading, Chidush for Religious Freedom and Equality, is systematic polling of public opinion on all matters of religion and state. And if you're interested, you'll be able to find it on our website, which is on the cards that you may found in front of you. We publish an annual religion and state index. And one of the questions we systematically ask is, we say there are a number of conflicts in Israeli society. Now, we list domestic conflicts. We do not compare it to security because obviously, as Dr. Tzemach said, security trumps everything. But we say there are a number of conflicts that Israeli society is facing. And we say rich and poor, left and right, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, secular and Haredi, and veteran Israelis and new immigrants. Which of these conflicts do you hold to be the most acute conflict Israeli society is facing? And growingly, there is no even comparison between the extent to which people hold the conflict of religion and state and secular and Haredi, which tops the lists, and everything else is following by a margin of at least 30%. Now, fortunately, Ashkenazim and Sfaradim and Vatikim, veteran Israelis and new immigrants are non-issues. Rich and poor and left and right are significant conflicts in the eyes of Israelis, but as I say, they lag behind by more than 30 percentage points. So yes, these are issues that are extremely relevant and agitating to the average Israeli. Now, asking about whether we are talking about civil unions or civil marriages, that is a real complicated question. Obviously, the campaign that we are launching is about freedom of choice in marriage. There are two pending approaches in the Knesset today. Labor has submitted a bill for civil marriage. Yesh Atid has submitted a bill for civil unions. The important thing to understand is that for Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, submitting a bill for civil unions is not the civil unions of gay couples in America, but beyond the name civil union, it carries with it identical rights and obligations, fully identical to that of a married couple. The battle is on. Obviously, we would prefer to have the option for free choice in marriage. But how the political system will ultimately translate it into reality remains to be seen. To those who did not hear, the question was, so is this about pluralism and are we trying to get the different religious options for Israelis to be able to benefit from? Both a modern Orthodox organization and Hartman Institute, as well as Reform and conservative movements, are part of this nucleus campaign. And the thinking was that it's probably more likely politically and acceptable to the movements to have the state establish a civil registration and for the couples to be able to choose religiously whatever they want. And they will be able to have either Reform or conservative or modern Orthodox celebrate their marriage without the state interfering with it. Does everybody hear the questions?
It always pays to repeat it.
Okay. So the question was, how important is it to the political powers that be? We see the public support for it, but is it something that the political parties are taking seriously? Now, I will say they're taking it more seriously now than they have ever before, because we have both coalition parties, such as Yesh Atid and Hatnuah, and opposition parties, such as the Labour Party, propose elaborate, serious bills that would regulate civil marriage or civil unions. In the past, this was something that was traditionally done by Meretz, and there was a token vote, and a handful of Knesset members voted for it, and that was the end of it until the next battle. So yes, it's now taken more seriously than ever before. Now, they have other fish to fry. And we all know that. We read the papers. And that is why the partnership between the Israeli groups and individuals who fight for freedom of marriage and for a civil society and for the realization of that vision of Israel, which is both Jewish and democratic, truly Jewish and democratic, namely pluralistic and inclusive and tolerant, and the overwhelming majority of world Jewry that would be able to relate, to align with, and I've always been thinking, the iron gauge, the challenge of engaging with Israel is the challenge of, do you feel that Israel is embracing you, is welcoming you? Or is Israel saying to you, send your checks and, keep your views to yourself? There is no doubt in my mind that our ability to come together in a meaningful push for that to become a reality, as Dr. Minna Tzemach has indicated, can change the priority list of the politicians. After all, they basically respond to their customers when their customers take the time to speak up. When they don't, we already see it more seriously treated than ever before that I remember, and I believe that now is a window of opportunity to actually make it happen. One more sentence about that, because I'm traveling back and forth and speaking to as many groups and individuals as I can about it, because I believe in the partnership. I believe in the partnership existentially, not just as a political ploy. And I meet quite a number of people who tell me, listen, there is the Iranian nuclear threat, there is the Arab Spring, there is what's happening in Syria, etc. Is that a time to raise these issues? And I spoke in Boston recently, and there was a dinner before the program, and I met a very active, very serious, committed AIPAC lay leader, and she again tells me the same thing, and I tell her, that's not how Israelis feel. You look at the results of the last elections and you realize Netanyahu tried to follow on his dramatic appearance at the UN and tried to get Israelis to relate to this visual, if you remember the bomb and the red line, etc., except he couldn't sell that in Israel because that's not what moved Israelis. Israelis want to gain control over our life and our society and have a real civil society. You look at the arts, you look at the literature, you look at the creativity, and you realize Israelis are not driven noon and night by the Iranian threat. So this wonderful, committed, serious lady tells me, well, I guess you Israelis don't know what's good for you. So I hope and trust that you actually do know both what's good for us and what's good for you. It was yours? Yes, please.
Yes, I was very impressed with what both of you said and certainly support your objectives. And in looking at the statistics that were presented, which would sort of tip towards your objectives, to me, it doesn't seem like you're anywhere near close to there yet. Because if it's 62% support, as I understand it, it's not firm, violently to the death support. It's kind of like maybe 40% are strong, 20% are kind of there, but not so certain. But the 38% opposed are fervently opposed. And you were talking about the political system as well. So if the two of you could sort of integrate what I will call, what do you really need to get to? You need 80-20 to have success, 85-15 to have success. And in the political system, how does that translate so you can actually get legislation passed by the only group whose percentages really matter, which is in your legislature?
That's an extremely important question. I don't know whether Minna wants to. Okay, let me relate to it, and we'll see if Minna wants to say something from her, political analysis experience. The numbers that you have there are numbers in a previous poll that we have run. As you could see from Dr. Tzemach's poll, the percentage has actually risen since then by a few more percentage points. So that the support is growing. Our figures were 62%, you have 66%. Okay. But it's in the same ballpark figure. Now, the truth of the matter is we don't need 80%. What we need is 61 Knesset members. And we believe that politically, there are probably 48 Knesset members as of today who are fully committed to effecting change. And the challenge, therefore, is a group in the middle who is subject to change. As Dr. Tzemach said, in the past, they have changed their opinion when they felt that there was good reason to do so. That brings me back to emphasize, and I cannot emphasize it enough, the way that we can generate greater constructive pressure and invest in a vision of Israel which would make it the kind of Israel that we all aspire to, is by working together. Because the other element is that I've so often come across American friends, partners, supporters who say, what can we do? Do they listen to us? The interesting thing is that just the other day, there was another study that was presented to the the Jewish Media Summit, that 71% of Israelis are saying Israel should take into consideration the impact of its policies on diaspora Jewry. 51% said they should consider the positions of diaspora Jewry when they shape their policy. Now, let there be no misunderstanding. The Women of the Wall, something that I'm sure many of you have heard about, some of you may have been involved with in some way or another. They have been praying at the wall for 25 years. Nobody took notice until about a year and a half ago, when the consul general in Los Angeles and the ambassador in Washington and others have started receiving expressions of concern from people who said, this is unacceptable. This is not what we expect Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to opt to behave towards women who all they want is to pray. And the fascinating political reality was that once you started speaking up, that disinterest, that sort of, just turning the back to the issue changed, and both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister Bennett, the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, and Natan Sharansky, the head of the agency, have taken up this issue and said we'll invest tens of millions of dollars in order to prepare the Robinson's Arch area, etc. The details are not important. They really are not important. What's important is on the Women of the Wall, on who is a Jew, frankly on Soviet Jewry, because those of you whose memory go back to the Soviet Jewry movement, the Israeli government didn't want you to be involved in this overt battle. They said, we prefer to work it out, in closed smoke rooms. But you felt differently. You felt this was something sufficiently important for you to take on and basically challenge both the Israeli government and the Soviet Union and the American administration. And we prevailed. And it really goes back to the point that Minna said before. We must overcome that sense of powerlessness and the belief that this isn't within our hands to accomplish. We heard about the spies, the Joshua and Caleb and the 10 that said, there are giants there, what can we do? And they say, Alon na'aleh ki yachol nuchal. We should move on, we should take this on because it is within our hands to achieve. So it isn't about 80-20. It's about 61 Knesset members. It's about a handful of Knesset members in the middle, many of whom may be getting political donations from you. It was very interesting. And Netanyahu received 98% of his primaries political campaign donations from American Jews. 98%.
I want to add something. In this Knesset, 50% of the members of the present Knesset are new. They haven't been in the previous Knesset. Most of them are young people, very energetic. They want change, and they believe that yes, we can. And they do believe, and they do, and some of them took part in the protest 2 years ago. And most of them want to make change. They don't have any commitment to groups, to institutes. And I meet them in the Knesset. They are so energetic, and I do believe that they will bring change.
I think there was the last question. I had pointed to 5 people. It was yourself. Last question, and with that we'll conclude. And other people who have questions, you'll be able to come up here. Yes, please, sir.
It's been touched a little bit, but are there any lessons for them to be, they have constitutional issues that we're having in the United States? Any similarities, anything that you could learn from us, what's going on over there, particularly with the, probably an upcoming Supreme Court decision in the next year?
There definitely are. At least 2 that come to mind right away. One has to do with the question that that I was asked first, namely civil unions versus civil marriage. And I spoke with some of the leaders of the marriage equality movement because I was very interested in these very questions. And I was told, of course we wanted marriage. We didn't want to settle for civil unions, but we figured that politically it would be conducive to accept civil unions at the point that it was offered and move on. And indeed, it got to the point where civil unions are no longer deemed as legitimate and acceptable, and no one will seriously talk about it, but they felt that campaign-wise, that realization of this, of the cause, took them via the civil unions first, and had they refused to the civil unions altogether, they would not have been where they are today. The second point is very interesting. Also, they said, some of the campaign leaders said, they attempted to present the campaign based on a rational analysis having to do with the right to marry, with legal rights, with civil rights. It spoke to some, but it was not until the point when they personalized the battle. And it was, I do it for my brother. I do it for my daughter. When it was connected with the faces, with the pain, with the commitment, with the concern of individuals, that it moved on to the next level of generating much greater support and active support. So in many ways, we are learning those very lessons, both in our thinking about what would we be willing to settle for, and setting very clear thresholds beyond which we would not settle, but some compromises that we are willing to make. And already the reform and conservative movements have, I think, made a tremendous compromise by saying we are not insisting, certainly not at this point, on having equal rights for Reform and conservative rabbis to those of Orthodox rabbis, and we would agree to have civil marriages that would enable us to have a private, a Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, or modern Orthodox for that matter ceremony, and that is fine with us for the time being. Even though the general public supports freedom of choice in marriage and supports the right of non-Orthodox rabbis to officiate marriages. And similarly, we certainly will be once, this is sort of a pre-campaign launch. The figures, and I would appreciate if you do not disclose them because they have not been made public yet. They are part of the campaign that will be launched. And once the campaign is launched, it will include individuals like Tanya, like Sarah, like Jessica, and others involved in telling their story.
Thank you both very much.